Welcome to Widemindedness with Victoria Ball, the podcast in which I interview expert guests who want to join me in celebrating that life is not black and white. Our society is increasingly divided, and the us versus them mentality seems to dominate our conversations and relationships with others. I believe that life is much richer when we widen our minds to consider multiple opinions and perspectives. So challenge your assumptions and let's become truly wide-minded together. Welcome to part 3 of an interview I recorded with Eamonn Gearon, a specialist in all things Middle East. He talks to me about the Islamic Golden Age, and when part 2 left off, we were talking about how King Offa of Mercia, you might know him because of Offa's Dyke, was minting coins that had Latin inscriptions as well as what appeared to be Arabic inscriptions.
Gone so far that a king of Mercia is trying to emulate coins that have Arabic inscriptions on as a means, I would argue, of opening up a form of diplomacy, an economic diplomacy, a form of common currency, no pun intended, so that we could have better, if not integration, at least understanding between these very different people. I mean, that coin is there. He didn't do it just because it looked pretty. There was definitely an outreach going on. But that's way back in the 8th century.
A not insignificant period where there was this notion of engaging with people outside your own group and your own type.
Absolutely.
I really became so interested in this period when I was traveling and studying in southern Spain in my teenage years. And it's interesting because, like you, I was there actually studying Spanish language, but also the Inquisition and the bits of European history that we tend to learn about in a Western curriculum. But it was then that I became so fascinated. I saw obviously the incredible palace, the Alhambra, and discovered the cities of Cordoba and Granada, Sevilla. And it's there that I would like to, although in a slightly different period to when they were built, I'd like to jump to that space now, the Iberian Peninsula, because I'd love you to introduce us to Moses Maimonides and tell us a bit more about him.
Well, another fascinating character. It's... I was brought up as an Irish Catholic. My knowledge of Judaism begins pretty much with my arrival at university as an undergraduate to read theology. And that's when I start looking at the Jewish faith. And of course, I've got many Jewish friends, both from the Middle East and beyond. But Maimonides is the name that comes up again and again. He's a 12th century individual who is said again and again to be the greatest scholar of Jewish law and scripture that ever lived. And he was born into a period in history where Cordoba had been one of the greatest cities on earth. But it was about to come to an end. Not the greatness of Cordoba, but the peace and security that was afforded to Jews and Muslims living in that city. And that's really interesting because we had the rise of another Muslim power called the Almohads. And when the Almohads arrive and take over Cordoba and surrounding areas, they prove themselves to be extremely intolerant. And it's at that time that Jewish families such as Maimonides and Muslim families are either put to the sword or sent into exile. Those that convert aren't ever fully trusted. And so whilst we're not leaving Andalusia quite yet, at the age of 13, Maimonides and his family are forced to flee. And they go into exile. So there they are, refugees.
Refugees, yes.
Absolutely, looking for a better life, somewhere that's safe and secure. And after a number of years of travel across North Africa and sojourns in different places, they find themselves being welcomed into the capital of another caliphate that exists at the time, and that's the Fatimid Caliphate, the only Shia Muslim caliphate in history that had its capital in Cairo. And there, this Jewish family is welcomed, and they're welcomed because when the Fatimids are defeated in the year 1171 by a name that I'm sure we all know, Saladin. So Saladin is the one Muslim name probably we knew at school growing up. Saladin conquers the Fatimids and employs Maimonides to be one of his physicians. Again, another example of an enlightened ruler seeing the best talent around and keeping hold of it. But I
Yes.
think I've taken us away from Andalusia too soon. Let's go back, shall we, to the glory that
Please.
was Cordoba. Um, so Maimonides is born in 1135, probably 100 years before that, the year 1000 roughly. Cordoba was perhaps the most advanced metropolitan area on Earth, except with the exception, I should say, of a city or two in China that would have a similar population of
Right.
around 500, 600,000, which is astonishing, really. I mean,
Yes.
cities go up and down. Um, Ancient Rome is reckoned to be the first city on Earth that had a population of 1 million.
Hmm.
But by the year 1000, it was down to tens of thousands. I mean, it had
Hmm.
just been destroyed and depopulated. But so Cordoba's on the up at this stage. Um,
And that's a big population for this period.
yeah, it is.
Hmm.
And what they provided was not just security, but there were um, public facilities. I think that's really interesting.
Hmm.
When a state invests in things like bathhouses,
Hmm.
um, there were bathhouses in Cordoba at this period of Muslim rule, when to bathe was still being condemned in Christendom as a dangerous act. Uh,
Gosh.
I'm glad I'd rather have lived in Cordoba, I think, than
Yes.
Christendom at the same time. I mean, even as far as Germany, it was a writer who came back from their travels and spoke of Cordoba as being the ornament of the world. It's a
Yes.
lovely phrase, which was taken up as the title for a book about
Excellent book.
Cordoba. Yeah, it
Yeah.
is good, isn't it? Yeah,
Yeah. Maria Rosa Menocal. It's a
that's it.
brilliant book.
Thank you.
Really, really good. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a scholar that I'm going to bring in now, just because I really like the way he phrases this, and it takes us away from any criticism that we're glossing over the difficulties that citizens had, and that's Bernard Lewis. Bernard Lewis was a great scholar of Middle Eastern history who, in later years, spoke more about contemporary events in the Middle East, and when he did so, I think he wasn't perhaps as careful as he had been in his earlier academic work, shall we say. But speaking about Cordoba at this time, he would say that Jews and Christians in Cordoba were second-class citizens. But, he said, they were citizens nonetheless, and they had rights afforded them that no Jew or Muslim in Europe had. So it's worth saying that it might not have been perfect, but they had legal protections that would not have been extended to Jews and Muslims, I say, in Europe at the time. So that's important. They were protected under the law.
And that is why I keep making this point, to whenever we discuss one of these people or characters, to keep thinking, who do I know from European history, or who do I know from history I have learned? Because it's so important to keep reminding ourselves when we're talking about, because you're right, this is not something, this acceptance of and tolerance of different beliefs and backgrounds and races or ethnicities. This was not commonplace at this time.
Well, just the moment we're talking about, before the rise of the Almohads, who upset everything, you
Yes.
could travel from Cordoba right across North Africa. I mean, many people travel by ship. It was often safer than by land because of local banditry. But if you're in any of the major population centers, any city in Andalusia, North Africa, as far as Cairo, then through to Baghdad, you would find a synagogue and a church. You would find places of worship for you in those cities. You
Incredible.
didn't find them in Europe. Why not? Well, perhaps because there were no um, Muslim travelers coming to Europe. Again, why not? Because there was nothing there. The money, the trade, the
Mm.
success was all located in those Muslim polities at the time.
Mm.
Europe just wasn't an attractive bet for travelers from the Middle East. I mean, sure, there are travelers that came through. I'm not saying there were none at all, but there wasn't the volume that allowed them to be able to find a mosque or a synagogue in any sort of town or city of significant size in Europe.
Mm.
Um, there's a pope that I'd like to bring in, if I may.
Please.
um, Pope Sylvester, um, who was the first French-born pope. I think I'm right in saying, and his rule was from the year 999
Mhm.
until 1003 or 1004.
Mhm.
Well, Sylvester pops into my head because, to my knowledge, he's the only pope that was fluent in Arabic. And
Wow.
he was fluent in Arabic because he'd been to Andalusia and studied both there and in modern day Morocco. And he'd
Hmm.
studied Arabic, and he is often credited with bringing the abacus and Arabic slash Hindu numerals into
Mm.
Europe. Not entirely successfully, because 200 years after his death, there were still moves to try and have these Saracenic numbers banned
Hmm.
by vested interests who'd rather keep on using Roman numerals. But if you've ever, worked with Roman numerals,
Yes.
uh, perhaps tallying up your shopping bill or whatever, you can see it's a great deal easier to use the so-called Arabic numbers that came originally from India. Um, so Pope Sylvester, when he became Pope, he was attacked by his critics as having become a Muslim in secret, that he was in league with the devil, and all of this because he spoke Arabic. And he spoke
Mm.
Arabic because that's where the greatest scholarship was taking place at the time.
We're opening up so many avenues
Sorry.
here.
Yes.
No, I'll have to just do a whole series with you. um, Now, could you tell me, was it Maimonides who said that incredibly enlightened phrase, the one about teach your tongue?
It is wonderful, isn't it? And it's advice for any parent as well with young children, I think. Maimonides wrote, "Teach your tongue to say, 'I do not know,' and you will make progress."
I mean,
It's very important to own up to the limitations. It's again a development of the ancient Greeks idea that the wise man is the one who knows what he doesn't know.
yes,
You keep searching, and Maimonides. I mean, he what a life he had. One of the other great um, one of his writings is a marvelous line where he says, "Do not consider it proof just because it is written in books, for a liar who will deceive with his tongue will not hesitate to do the same with his pen."
hmm.
Isn't that
Yeah,
terribly clever, isn't it?
terribly clever and so relevant at all points of
Yeah,
history.
throughout history, indeed. It was definitely his scholarship, his knowledge, his wisdom, his insight into human frailty, as well as his understanding of Jewish texts. It was definitely formed by being able to spend time with Christian and Muslim scholars and religious men, and to have argument and debate and think about why they believe what they believe, and developing his ideas as a result of this, both in Andalusia and in Fatimid, and later under Saladin, Cairo. I mean, this is really important.
Yes.
His works, Maimonides' works, though, you want to talk about reverberations and echoes. Um, his Maimonides wrote a wonderful book, a philosophical work called "The Guide for the Perplexed," which sounds like
Hmm.
a manual for our own times.
Mm.
Um, but this Guide for the Perplexed was, studied and at length by the likes of Thomas Aquinas and
Wow.
Duns Scotus and Miser Eckhart.
Mm.
These people in the 13th century and beyond, they didn't reject it because it was written by a Jew. They recognized the scholarship and the wisdom.
Mm. I love this idea of an openness to what we don't know. For me, that's a pillar of wide-mindedness. In your lecture series for the Great Courses, you use a brilliant quote by Bernard Lewis to indicate how this period really was a melting pot of different ideas and opinions. And I quote, "The Islamic culture of the Middle East was the first culture that was truly international, intercultural, interracial, and in a sense, intercontinental. And its contribution, both direct and indirect, to the modern world is immense." Can I just ask you, why do you think this cultural openness, this human flourishing, was able to take place at this time?
There are a lot of features here. Certainly, I know the great man theory of history isn't so popular these days, but in these times that we're talking about, when we didn't have democracies and regular election cycles with outcomes that would be respected by all parties, we have to acknowledge the role of individual rulers. Whether it's Roger II of Sicily or Harun al-Rashid, they did have an important part to play. And as I've said before, the most successful of these emirates or caliphates or kingdoms or princedoms were those of the enlightened rulers. And
Mm.
I could give you 100 names from this period to demonstrate that very effectively. Now, added to that, I don't think it would be terribly easy to be an enlightened ruler who would invest, by some estimates, 30% in Andalusia under Caliph Abdul Rahman III, up to a third of his coffers was spent on education every year.
Mm.
But that could only happen if you were at peace. I
Yeah.
think that they had secured their borders, they had perhaps defeated everybody around them, but then they go beyond that to making alliances. And once there's peace and security and safe borders, and you can then not retreat behind the drawbridge, but say, okay, what have we got here? We don't have to spend that 30% of the budget or whatever it might be
Yes.
on a bigger,
Defense. And yes.
bigger and better army. We can strengthen ourselves through knowledge. But again, that comes back to having an enlightened ruler. You can't
Mm.
have one without the other.
What do you think its biggest contribution is, or perhaps should be, to the modern world?
I suppose the first answer that I would have given as a naive schoolboy, had I come across this era at all, it would have been the scholarship that saved the works of the ancient Greeks and others.
Right.
I mean, that's
Mm.
that. If that was my final answer, it would diminish the achievements of the Golden Age. I'm not going to do that, but let's just
Mm.
look at that for a second, if we may, because it's inconceivable to go to university or to study at home philosophy these days without the ancient Greeks.
Mm.
So try and conceive of that. Imagine, had we not been fortunate to have had these works, all of those works, without exception, saved thanks to the scholarship and translation movement of the Islamic Golden Age, what would a philosophy degree look like today?
Mm.
It's hard to imagine, and not just philosophy as a subject, but theories about democracy, about citizenship, about rights, all of these things that came from ancient Greece, and they didn't start in ancient Greece, of course. They had their own foundational blocks from other parts of the world and earlier civilizations too. But the Islamic Golden Age, I think we should see as a bridge between different periods in history, and you can't get to the European Renaissance without this Islamic Golden Age bridging moment. Um,
Mm.
but that's not to diminish the Golden Age. There was so much more they did for themselves. Development of philosophy under Al-Kindi, development of medicine under Ibn Sina, better known in the West as Avicenna.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he wrote a medical manual that was still being taught in the University of Oxford and the University of Paris 700 years later.
Incredible.
Uh, I mean, if he were able to claim royalties on 700 years worth of textbooks, can you imagine? Um, that's serious scholarship. People weren't using him because they hated Muslims. They weren't using him because they needed to do him a favor. They used his, a canon of medicine because it was a great work which addressed
Mm.
all the ailments possible. I mean, the legacies, they're innumerable. The fountain pen was created during this period by a ruler who told his advisors he was sick of getting ink on his clothes. And he wanted a
Wow.
closed chamber that could retain the ink without spilling, and he could open it any time. This came out
Gosh.
of Cairo under the Fatimids too. Uh, is that the greatest legacy? I don't know.
But I love this idea, and I really wanted to leave listeners with this sense of I just love that so often this period is referred to in terms of its chronology and its time as the Dark Ages. And I
Yeah.
just really wanted to leave listeners with this notion of this glittering jewel of a civilization that we could mention the fountain pen, we could mention so many other inventions and ideas that were created and fostered during this period, and it's only dark insofar as it's been forgotten in some of our minds as modern consumers of history. And I think that is just an image and a moment of wide-mindedness, if you like, that I want to leave my listeners with, both us to be wide-minded in our approach to history and what we look at and what we research, but also this notion that there was an open-minded period when cultural flourishing was allowed to develop and grow.
There's a line that just came to me from a writer called George Kimball, and it's a book he wrote about Africa, published in I think 1950.
Hmm.
And there's a wonderful line that I use with my students, whether they be diplomats or university people, and he wrote, "The darkest thing about Africa has always been our ignorance of it." And I think that we could definitely use for the Islamic Golden Age and indeed the modern Middle East. That if
Absolutely.
we see it as a dangerous place, a place that we ought to be fearful of, it's probably because of our ignorance of the area and what's actually happening there. And the same would be true in the 10th century Baghdad as it would in the 21st century.
Eamonn Gearon, it has been such a pleasure. I could listen to you talk about this for hours. It has been my total honour to have you on the Widemindedness podcast. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the invitation. I've enjoyed it thoroughly.
I really hope you enjoyed this episode of Widemindedness with Victoria Ball. Help others learn about it by rating, reviewing, and subscribing. For more great wide-minded content, follow @Widemindedness Victoria Ball on Instagram, @Widemindedness on Twitter, and sign up to the monthly newsletter at victoria-ball.com.